the issues with PTSD is, well, there's a number of issues. And one is a collapse of the meeting of human needs, which is also a collapse in happiness. With that can often come the absence of being able to contribute anything meaningful, which in turn leads to shame. These situations often trigger some of the darkest emotions. When there's not enough support, there can be depression. And in these states, increased addiction, pain management, and violence, and an uncertainty about the future. And this needs a response. This is a shout out, so to speak, that an adult presence, be it you or somebody else, if you're unable to respond, needs to respond. There are messages coming out, things are not working, things are going poorly, and these messages come, of course, because they demand a response. Otherwise, the life is in an indefinite tailspin. And in going through this period myself, it's not always clear which direction to move in. Some seemingly healthy directions lead into emotional tailspins. There can be a lot of fear and uncertainty about all these new feelings, the fact that one thing can snowball into another. And so whether it's you or a group of friends, or you and a therapist, or you and an advocate, or just you, there needs to be a response. And I found myself relatively alone, and the question is how to assess progress and how to respond. So I want to outline the guidelines that I used personally, and encourage this as a template for a set of directions that are moving in a generally positive direction. The first one is, and so this is intended as a guide to, steer behavior. And, one of the first things that goes into a tailspin around trauma and PTSD is one's human needs can collapse. We all have the same basic human needs, outlined beautifully by Abraham Maslow. And the first human need is to survive. And so if your survival is in jeopardy, the question is, what actions can you take that are possible to be taken within your current situation that increase your odds of survival? Whether that's financial, whether it's social, whether it's, in health, whatever it is that is necessary to help you survive. And then, of course, you're surviving, but the next level that we have a need for is certainty around survival. And so these are a series of actions that would increase certainty. And so everything that we do, be it handing out flyers about a service we offer, be it taking medication that we need, if we need medication of some kind, be it keeping our body somewhat active, so that we're not, in this cocoon where toxins build up with a series of thoughts, which are, traumatic loops often. These each produce toxins in the body, and a certain amount of physical exercise that is enjoyable can burn these toxins off so we can see a little bit clearer. In doing so, we increase the probability of surviving and our security of survival. Next comes the human need to experience love and belonging. If you don't have a financial crisis on your hands, there's a certain amount that you can do just logistically to increase love and belonging. I find the United States as a general country to be one of the most difficult cultures in which to experience love and belonging. It's easier in Europe in general. There's certain places, more so than others, certainly. And it's easier in Asian cultures where there's more of an emotional sense of empathy. It's more of a feminine empathy-based culture. And so, I got myself to the Philippines, I got myself to Thailand, in a very important effort to develop a sense of belonging, a sense of love and belonging. And this basically consists of, here's where I am, here's where I'm at. Is that acknowledged? Is that discounted, denied, shamed, etc.? Or is it acknowledged? You're there. Secondly, what it means is it accepted? Are you accepted where you're at? This is where you're at, and are you accepted in that state? And then thirdly, when you're in pain, empathy is what communicates a sense of belonging, which is time, which is presence, which is attention, which is shared feelings. It was interesting to me that a Thai woman who didn't speak English and with whom I was not lovers and with whom I had no ties other than that she was the best friend of an ex-girlfriend, and she cared about me. Through a translator, this Thai woman would cry because she understood how much pain I was in. And there's a sense when someone allows your feelings to matter and prioritizes listening and understanding, that you belong, because you belong with the people who when you have a feeling or you have a need, that it matters to them. And that shows up emotionally, and it shows up around prioritization of time. And so the ability to create a sense of love and belonging. I also found that very slow, soothing massage helped with that. And I needed to train the masseuse on how to touch me in a way that helped me come back in my body and feel that I was okay. I don't know, in my experience, a good percentage of Western masseuses are much more like, this is my job, I move your body around like this, I don't want to hear about your feelings, etc. And if I need to be touched in a certain way, again, it's more common, in my experience, in a Western culture, for someone to take that as a criticism, like, I know my job, I'm the masseuse, etc. And I don't want to have that debate. I just want to say, I need to be touched at this speed and at this pressure in this way, and I need to be able to talk as I'm doing that. And is that received? And so, as I say, it's certainly easier if there's not an imminent time crisis or financial crisis to be able to, find some place in the world where you have that experience. I've always felt very at home from the first time I touched down on a plane in Thailand. I felt I'm more at home here than I am in my own country. And so that's where I went, during the deepest amounts of grief and pain and trauma around all of this. But however you can do that, I also found, ironically, that Quora and even some writing YouTube comments about what was going on and discussing things, I actually felt more empathy and support from YouTube and Quora than I did anywhere else. And so there's a certain, here's where I'm at, this is me, and a sense of that being cared about in some way is the thing of love and belonging. At its deepest core, love and belonging looks like, look, you're going through, absolute shit hell, within the, it's kind of the worst pain within the human psyche, and you're going through that, and I'm not going to leave you, and your issue is my issue, and we're going to get you through this. And when someone actually knows what they're doing, and more importantly, has the ability to listen and empathize, that's sometimes all it takes to get out of trauma. And to relieve the question, am I going to make it? Because you're overwhelmed, you've lost perspective, and well, when you're overwhelmed and you've lost perspective, that's part of the traumatic state, but it's also not a very hopeful state in and of itself, because if you've lost perspective, you don't know if you're going to survive and make it or not. And so, having someone else assure that, and not just assure it as a way of getting you off their back, but assure it in the sense of, I'm going to make it my business to see that you make it. That's the kind of love and belonging that is incredibly valuable. And some families offer that, and some therapists offer that. Not so much, I have not met that in a Western therapist, because, it's more, I will listen to you at our next session for 50 minutes, which is a very different, statement than I'm going to take a stand for your survival. And so that's, that's meeting that sense of love and belonging. And so, I didn't have that when this all hit, in family or otherwise. And it's very difficult in an abuse environment, because the abuser generally is most focused on minimizing the acknowledgement of their abuse, and then your need to be healed or belong comes secondary. It may be there, but it's a secondary agenda if you're in the environment that has hurt you, as a general rule. And so that's an issue. Touch. I found one friend who was willing to be a listening cuddle buddy, basically. For 6 hours a week, she'd come over in a platonic relationship and listen and cuddle. Well, that lifted a fair amount of the sense of panic, etc., and was another expression of love and belonging. Then there comes self-esteem. And this is the love that we earn for ourselves when we behave in the direction of how we would like to be in the world. We feel good about ourselves. And this is often decimated in PTSD. For example, I like to be very calm. I like to be very empathic. I don't usually ever raise my voice. I'm, most of my life not been a blaming person, for example. In high amounts of pain, etc., I felt an explosion of all that. So it was very hard to love the me that I had become with PTSD, because it was, going in the opposite direction of the person I normally identified with and wanted to be. And so, in this area, it can be helpful to educate oneself on the symptoms of trauma, the biological backdrop of trauma, and just to understand the continuum. Some people kill themselves, some people, completely destroy their lives and everyone's life around them. And some people never get better, and so it partly begins in terms of this earning self-esteem, understanding the new set point, that feeling helpless and feeling irritable or having rage attacks is normal in, a culture like ours, when you suddenly find yourself without support, thrust into these feelings. And it's not who you are, it's who you become with this matrix of intense trauma. And so then the question is, are you taking the steps that, would put you on track, or, for example, ahead of the curve? And here again, data is helpful. I had been sexually abused. emotionally abused, spiritually abused by my therapist, and so I looked to what was happening in the Catholic Church, for example, with the whole Catholic Church cover-up of the 5% of pedophilic priests, and and for example, it takes 11 years for the average sexual abuse survivor to come forward if they're going to come forward. And so, I was coming forward within a year. Well, that's 11 times better than average. And so, it's not that I like that it took a year, and it's not that I liked, who I'd become in this way, but I could understand that within the data set, within the probability field of someone going through this particular type of trauma, that I was doing relatively well. For example, not everyone develops this thing called post-traumatic growth. And I was determined that come hell or high water, I was going to grow, in some way. And that's something I admire because I believe in growth. And so whatever your value system is, those were mine, moving in that direction is going to help you earn a sense of self-respect and self-esteem, and then also giving back the shame to the abuser, the culture of abuse, the culture of ignorance, the culture of fear, the culture of taboos, the culture of shame, the culture of sociopathic dissociation from the people that need the most help, the culture of stigmatization and humiliation, the culture of abandonment. All of these things, are important to understand and give that back to the culture, to the abuser. I don't believe in such a culture. I don't try and live in such a culture. I find myself within that culture. And if we understand the backwater, because the culture is very much like the river, and the river flows downstream. Now, when you go upstream, you've got to swim faster than the current. And, the tragedy in these situations is that sometimes the culture is pushing you downstream at 10 miles an hour. And in all the shock and all the grief and all the dissociation, you can swim upstream at 3 miles an hour. Well, you're still going to be pushed back 7 miles an hour. But the fact that you're swimming upstream 3 miles an hour is slowing the amount that you're being pushed downstream. And that's important to acknowledge. I'm being pushed downstream, but I'm swimming upstream, and I'm slowing it down 30%. And that's something, to appreciate and respect if you're able to get out there and swim at all against the current. Because our culture doesn't usually have a very nice end. If you just let the culture's, current take you as a trauma survivor wherever it wants to take you, it's generally into a downhill spiral, which may end up in homelessness, and then we shame and punish our homeless. It's a very cruel and sociopathic tailspin. That's on everyone. We created this culture, as hundreds of millions of people. We tolerate this culture as hundreds of millions of people. It's a very brutal culture for a number of minorities who often have a tremendous amount to offer. So that's kind of moving towards self-esteem. The next need that we have is to develop our gifts. And ironically, trauma as an ecstatic state. You have the static state, and then you have the ecstatic state. And when you go up in an ecstatic state, it's called ecstasy. When you go down in an ecstatic state, it's called trauma. When the status quo has been violated to such an extent that you're thrust outside of your normal persona, your normal routine, your normal life, you are now in ecstatic trauma. And that ecstatic state does have gifts because you're thrust into the unknown. And when you're violently thrust into the unknown, there can be a tremendous amount of fear, overwhelm, dissociation, because we're comfortable with the known, the static, the status quo. And we find ourselves in ecstasy. And it's valuable to note that when you're outside of the comfort zone, outside of the known, you can see things and learn things and become things that you couldn't be within that little bubble of the normal, of the normal framework. And there are gifts that are waiting to be, things to be learned, gifts to develop, etc. It's more of a military boot camp type initiation into those gifts. But you may discover a tremendous amount of empathy. For example, I became interested in the homeless people in my town because I realized how easily I could become homeless. And I also realized that that is the cruelest thing you could possibly do to someone with PTSD, and 42% of the homeless people wandering around my town have PTSD. And the last thing you want to do is create daily survival crisis, etc. for that. But even if one is homeless, there are certain things that increase the odds of survival: drinking water, eating protein, various things like that, over, not, and so. So there's the movement towards developing one's abilities and one's gifts. The next human need is to share those gifts with the world. And if one is in bitterness and hate and revenge because of all the abuse, etc., this is not the easiest thing, and don't worry about that. Focus on survival, security. Can you reach up into love and belonging? Can you move towards any sense of self-esteem? But every action that you take that puts you on this trajectory, which ultimately ends in a transcendence, where developing one's gift to a point where one can create the abundance that is possible when one cultivates and learns how to integrate those gifts with the culture, and ultimately shares something about oneself that can survive beyond the body, a legacy, an impact that ripples out after you're gone. We all have the need to have such an impact, to have a sense of meaning, that this lifetime wasn't just for nothing. So this is one continuum. And if you are taking any steps that move you up this continuum, congratulations. Many cannot and do not. That's a constructive action. The second thing is the continuum of emotion. Common emotions in trauma are hate. Hate is built up of helplessness, of hurt, and of pain that one doesn't feel capable of responding to. If you are in pain and in hurt and feel helpless, and particularly if you feel betrayed, your government isn't there for you, your family isn't there for you, the people who said they loved you, your friends are not there for you, you will hate them, because that's what produces the feeling of hate. You will blame them for not doing the things that could make your life so much easier, because that's what comes up as an emotion. That's the readout. The human heart is a scientific instrument. It measures what's going on inside and out, and it generates a feeling that says, hey, this is what's going on. If you're in hate, it means you're in pain, hurt, helplessness, probably feel betrayed, and it feels too big to deal with. If you can deal with it easily, if you're feeling happy, you're not going to feel hate. It's that simple. So hate is a message. Emotions are messages. And so one can track one's progress through a healing transcendent process by tracking one's hierarchy of emotions. Hate and revenge being kind of one of the bottom things. Helplessness, despair, apathy, etc. Being down at the bottom. As you move up from, the way through hate and rage, for example, is expression and integration, understanding it. This person could have done this and this, but they're not doing it. This person could look me in the eye, but they're pretending nothing is going on. This person is doing this, so I hate them. Understand it and say, aha, that's what produces hate. That's what produces blame, etc. Thanks for telling me. I'm in a hateful situation. I'm in a miserably unfair situation. Thanks for telling me. So that's the kind of response to feeling. Now, if you express it in some way, diary expressions, vlogging expressions. I've done a lot of vlogging as a way to get through that. Possibly communicating with the abuser, that can make it worse if they're in a denial shame pattern, or it may liberate. When I wrote to because this triggered all the childhood abuse dynamic again. And so, there was some gratification, when my abuser finally apologized, but it felt a little hollow because I had paid money for this abuse and they didn't even offer a refund, even after acknowledging all the abuse. How sincere is that? Do you admit that you sold someone a defunct, rotten product that ruined their life, and then say, but it's still full price for a crappy product? So that's a mixed bag. This brought up the childhood abuse, etc., and I wrote to my mother, and I really let her have it. Focusing on me. It's like I'm tired of making everyone else feel good so that they can abuse me and feel good about it. They may not be able to do anything else but abuse me, but at least I'm not going to pretend it's not going on. And so, I let members of my family have it, describing, what had gone on, how it had hurt me, I've had to deal with it, my whole life, etc. My mother actually showed up as an adult to some extent for the first time. Oh my goodness, I didn't understand that. I didn't know that affected you. And so there's some integration there, giving the feedback back to the system. That's how systems evolve, by the way. If a calculator, you plus 2 equals, and then there's nothing, because the calculator doesn't want to hurt your feelings and say that's only $4 in your account. 2 plus 2 equals 4. I don't want to hurt your feelings, so I'm just going to hide it, like so many children do in abusive environments. You don't get the data. And so systems evolve, be they family systems, cultural systems, etc., as they have feedback. We don't teach people how to respond to such feedback well, and we don't teach people what it's like to be in trauma, and we don't teach people how to get you out of trauma, and so they're probably not going to do that. Not because you're not worth it, but because our culture doesn't feel that we as human beings are worth that kind of trauma literacy. That's not your fault. But you can still do something about it. You can still, educate someone who wants to be educated, etc. I contacted past therapists who had missed traumatic symptoms, and I said, look, I gave you all these traumatic symptoms. You didn't even tell me what trauma was. Are you doing this to your current clients? And some of them got defensive, and some of them learned something and said, I did not understand that, and I recommended books and stuff. So the deep, dark emotions need to move towards expression. First, in a diary, figuring out what's going on, validating the feelings, and then expressing them. That's going to lift some of the feelings. Why? Because you're not so helpless, because you're helping yourself, and you're helping the culture. So there's not quite as much helplessness in the scenario. You're helping. So the helplessness can lift a little bit. As it lifts, you can function a little bit better. So then you can take more steps to improve your life. And then as you improve your life, you have something to have a higher feeling around. Like, gee, I'm grateful that I did that. I'm still mad as hell that people set me up in this way, but I'm doing something about it, and I'm grateful for that. And so the emotions kind of move up into, from hate and rage to anger, from anger into, more expression. I'm angry about this, I'm disgusted by this, I'm pissed off at this, I'm very sad about this. I'm very hurt about this. Hurt can often move towards anger, which can be helpful if you're paralyzed or depressed. Move the hurt towards anger. If you're hurt and you're in a state of chronic hurt, one of the things you can infer from that are that there's a lot of sociopathic behavior around you. Because if you're hurting and you've got safe, intelligent, empathic people, that as soon as you say you're hurting, they say, what can we do? How can we help? And they actually help. You're probably not going to hurt that much. So if you're hurting chronically, it's probably because you don't feel comfortable doing that because too many people have rejected you. Well, that's not your fault. That's a cult of abandonment and rejection. You didn't sit down necessarily and say, I would like to live in a culture of abandonment and rejection. It's harder, of course, if you have abused other people in their need, etc., because then it's going to be a guilt. Like I hurt the last person when they needed my help, and now I feel embarrassed, asking for help. But eventually, you're going to move up towards enjoyment, and you're going to move to some fun, and maybe a little bit more fun next month. It's taking 4 years for me to kind of navigate through this process. Some people do it rapidly, some people never get out. But if you are moving authentically, not shaming and blaming and suppressing any of your feelings at all, but expressing your feelings, integrating your feelings, understanding the messages of your feelings and doing things about those feelings, getting out, if every time you talk with someone you're made to feel invisible and small, stop it. My chiropractor would say, hey, how you doing? I'd say, I'm miserable, I'm depressed, I'm traumatized, I'm still getting over the sexual abuse of this therapist, And he would say absolutely nothing. I felt small and invisible. I've just shared really important things in response to your question, and it's as if I don't exist. So I confronted him. I said, look, I feel like shit leaving your chiropractic office because no matter what I say, you don't say a single empathic, sympathetic, anything response, and I feel invisible. That feels worse than your physical adjustment. Well, it turned out the chiropractor had all of his own stuff and fear about that. And of course, he didn't receive any trauma training, and he had his own panics and stuff. And so I wrote a review about, here's what it's like to be a sexual abuse survivor in this chiropractic office. And one of his other patients was one of my abusers. And so it felt doubly shitty, about it. Well, I can empathize with him because he's received no training. He's an American guy who has probably been shamed for having feelings just like me. He hasn't learned anything about emotional literacy or empathic feelings. He's learned to push bones around, which he does a good job at. But in a healing office, you need more than that. Because we do sexually abuse people in this culture, and because that does create muscle cramps, and because muscle cramps do misalign the bones, sexual abuse survivors are going to go to chiropractors to put the bones right. And if the chiropractors have no idea what to do there, that's a lapse in the culture. That's a lapse in their training. It doesn't mean that you're wrong for having feelings. And so I, wrote there was a certain release around that. I do matter. My feelings do matter. Well, then I feel happier. I feel more valuable. So the feelings rise on this continuum towards enjoyment, towards fun, towards gratitude. If your feelings naturally are making that transition with volatility, with being re-triggered and knocked down, but, if month by month, you notice, a little bit of joy. I haven't felt that. And I remember when I flew my radio control plane for one of the first time in several years because I'd been so anxious and tense. I didn't want to do anything. I was worried about survival. How do I handle this? I was overwhelmed. When I flew my plane for the first time in years, I almost cried because it's like a moment of joy. I'm going to give myself a little bit more of that if I can handle it, and still, process it. So this is, and then meditations ended up being, incredibly healing. I worked with the channel Lazarus and forgiveness meditations, morning and evening meditations. My whole approach is you don't have to believe anything. If it's, if channels are real, if they're not, doesn't matter. If you can get in touch with a part of yourself that loves you by any means whatsoever, even if it's a scam, it's not a scam for you. You've found a part that loves you, and so it doesn't matter what's going on out there. If you can do that in any way whatsoever, that's miraculous, because many people don't, in this state. Many people, sink down. And so this is a trajectory. The other is, healing the past and the future. This ties in again with meditation in most parts. Healing the inner child that has been wounded, and creating a framework of possibility where there could be a future that's better than the future that might have been without this. Now, you may not believe that will happen, and statistically it's all up in the air. There's a minority of people in the traumatic field, through cultural shame, ignorance, no trauma training, often inadequate therapeutic help, poor family support and all that never have post-traumatic growth. Not because there's anything fundamentally wrong with them, but because they don't run into an environment or know how to create an environment that makes that possible. And so, I feel lucky that I understood, like I did, I think, 100 hours of healing massage and stuff in the Philippines with a woman that I had trained to engage in and while she was alleviating all that pain in my body, I could go back to imagining a possible future that was beautiful and take steps in that direction. So healing the past, creating a future is another, dynamic. When you're in PTSD, you're generally locked in a tape loop that is of the darkest moments of your life going on over and over again, feeling the worst you've ever felt. That's that past. But there are other past memories that are more beautiful. And there is a future that is possible. It's possible. That is a lot better than that. And as we open up to that possibility and heal the past, healing the child, healing the adolescent, EMDR is part of that process of interrupting and diffusing events. Any protocol that you can find that heals the past, that allows you to let go and give the abusive culture and the abusive individuals back the abuse. And also forgive oneself for allowing it at some level to say, look, I didn't go to school and learn how to heal trauma. I didn't learn a single hour of emotional literacy in my entire education. Well, what kind of an education program is that? That's a shitty education program. We all have feelings, but we don't learn how to deal with them. We learn how to shame and suppress them. So I'm not going to hold that against myself. I'm going to forgive myself for being unable, in an emotionally and traumatically illiterate state, in a culture that shares that illiteracy and ignorance, for falling into one of the many sand traps this cult has set up, and which people fall in all the time and didn't see it coming because they didn't have the cues. They didn't say, oh, this is going near a traumatic event, because I don't even know what trauma is, and I don't know what traumatic events are, and I don't know what this. And so, of course, we fall in. And that's how we learn in a crude way. More sophisticated cultures, you learn by saying this could happen, and you mentor and you navigate through that. We teach people how to play golf, for example, and avoid the sand traps. We don't teach people how to avoid trauma sand traps. So you get good at golf in this culture. If you play and take lessons, you don't necessarily learn a goddamn thing about your feelings or how to move through. So healing the past and healing the future, which always begins with forgiving yourself and lifting the shame off, the blame off, etc. And just saying, yeah, this absolutely sucks, but it is not my fault. And I can do something a little better. And sometimes we're in addictive abuse cycles where we knowingly reenact abuse. We know it's the wrong thing to do. We shouldn't have hooked up with that person. We did it again compulsively. And so then we can again say, I'm an addict. I'm an addict in a culture that has not taught me how to heal addiction. So I'm going to have to learn it by myself. But in an emotionally and psychologically literate culture, I wouldn't have to be stumbling into this. I would be learning, these things. My teacher would say, look, a lot of our parents at home don't know this and this. This is what a healthy family looks like. Here's what your family looks like. These are not your fault. Here's what you can and cannot do about it. As you grow up, you can do more. And so you lift the shame off, which can then lead to self-forgiveness, which can then lead to letting go, learning from, and saying, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to take karate lessons so that I don't get raped. I'm going to carry, pepper spray or a handgun, etc., so I don't get mugged. I'm going to do things that empower me to have a brighter future, in which if I do encounter this unfortunate event again, I'll be ready. And that's a future worth living for, as opposed to I'm just helpless, stuck in, I can't prevent it, I'm helpless, etc. So taking the steps that empower us. So this is another continuum. If you are moving in that direction, taking any action to improve your future and release and heal the past, you are doing great. Now, the next thing is value and contributions. Now, this is a mixed bag. I felt, resentful, angry, like, why should I help this fucked up culture that, and so there's a time in grieving, etc., for blame, for hostility, for depression, for bargaining, for all of that. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross outlines this in the stages of grief, the stages of dying. Part of us is dying. And the question is, will a part of us be reborn? That's the question. In trauma, and particularly in PTSD, part of us dies. That's the reality, and we go through a grieving process. And many never recover. Something dies, and for the rest of their life, they're just partly not there because something's dead. If you are making any progress on this, you are making progress towards a rebirth, towards a letting in of some reality that couldn't or wouldn't have existed without this whole learning and dying and rebirthing process. That is by far the most luminous possibility that can come from this. You can end up, meaning I have ended up, not knowing I would, but just taking a bet, increasing the odds slightly, a little bit here, a little bit there, week after week, month after month. I've ended up in a reality with a lovely wife who I met in the midst of the PTSD and all that. And, and I said, it's interesting. I have never been this bad, meaning I'm the worst possible husband or partner that I've ever been. And that gives hope, right? Because if a relationship can grow in healthy ways when you are at your worst, well, then it can grow phenomenally when you're at your best. So in that sense, there's a certain opportunity. And so I kind of looked at this and I thought, if I keep making steady progress, there will never be a time when I'm this reactive, when I'm this controlling, when I'm this angry, when I'm this blaming, when I'm this critical. What we do to ourselves goes out to others. So if a human being can love me in that state, and I can love a human being in that state, well, there's no question we can love each other in a state that isn't, overwhelmed with pain and all of that. Now, moving towards value and contribution is one of the medicines to the feeling of worthlessness and not being wanted that this culture throws at people. In other words, if you're in massive amounts of pain and grief and trauma, and if you can't function very well, this culture basically gives the message that you're a loser and we don't really want you around. We may or may not tolerate you, but go away. You're not contributing anything. We like happy, positive people, which of course you would be if you weren't, participating in an abuse cycle. And this culture is happy to abuse you, but then it doesn't like the person you become once you're abused, which is, it's kind of cheap, isn't it? It'd be kind of like the kind of sociopathic relationship where I like hitting you over the head with a baseball bat, and then when you bleed, I say, oh, I can't stand the sight of blood, go away. Then you come back and I hit you over the head with a baseball bat, and I say, go away, you're bleeding. This cult whacks us over the head with a baseball bat, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes in infancy, and then has the audacity to say, well, we don't like the sight of all that blood. Just go away. And this is incredibly, juvenile. It's incredibly narcissistic and self-centered. That's part of the abuse cycle. And it tries to dump the inadequacy of the cult to stop the abuse. If you have been abused, this cult didn't stop the abuse. They didn't train your abuser not to abuse people. They didn't train your abuser not to break the abuse cycle. Your abuser was abused. By what? By this culture. And then your abuser abused you, because that's what abused people do who don't get support and healing. They didn't get support and healing not just in some magical, mythical place. In this culture, they didn't get support and healing. So this culture set you up to be abused. And then has the audacity to say, well, now that you've been abused, you're kind of tarnished. It's the kind of old joke of the narcissistic man who knocks some woman up and then says, oh, I'm not going to marry you because you're not a virgin, or it's that kind of setup. And it's disgusting. But you're not disgusting. That system of behavior is disgusting. And that's not all about you. And yes, it's easy for a majority to gang up on a helpless victim and make them the scapegoat. But the real scapegoat needs to be the cultural system itself. And this is difficult, how to contribute something, to such a pathetic culture in such a sense, as opposed to just punishing the shit out of it, which you can do by just staying sick and miserable and reminding everyone how fucked up the culture is by existing. And there's a certain, place for the satisfaction in that. However, at some point, the antidote to feeling the worthlessness and the shame, plus connecting with who you really are without that wound, meaning this wound does not bring out the best in us, but the best in us is there. And part of the grief and the anger and the helplessness is I want to be at my best, and I'm not getting the support from this cult to be at my best, and then I'm being punished for that. But, the real healing comes from saying, I'm bigger than that. This cult may be fucked up. My family may be fucked up. But there is still some part of me that is beautiful. There's some part of me that is bigger than this wound. And I don't want to live in the darkest place that this cult environment elicits in me. So I'm doing it for me. I'm going to be me. And it is fun. It is fun, ultimately, when the wound is healed, to contribute our gifts, to be seen, for our abilities and talents. So the how you contribute is totally up to you. But moving from completely dependent in a relationship where you're tolerated and resented and judged and shamed and all that, to relationships in which you are contributing something valuable. That is a continuum. The more value you are contributing, not by lying and covering up and pleasing your abuser and all that, But by genuinely learning things in this transcendent, in this ecstatic terrain, however painful, and bringing that out, perhaps you can empathize and protect and give something to other abusers or other abuse survivors, and help other abusers not abuse other abuse survivors. That's a relatively easy thing, because if you've been hurt this badly and you understand that it's not personal, that millions and millions of people on this planet are hurting that badly, not because they're born evil or anything like that, but because we don't learn how to treat them better, and they've gotten caught up in a wound that isn't healing. And if you've learned anything that can help them, that is a positive direction. So I focused on videos like this. It's if I'm going to be fuming and disgusted and all that, I'm going to put it out there in a way that someone might be able to benefit from. And it's affirming, because, my therapist may say, oh gosh, there he goes again, take my $200. But putting this information out in the community is a way of contributing. And it's also a way of moving towards self-esteem, where, we like feeling valuable. That's part of our nature. It's a need to contribute, to be a valuable member of some group, some emotional, social bond of some kind. And if that's other abuse survivors, contribute something to them. Help another abuse survivor. I started helping the homeless people in my town. And I said, I totally get it, and here's a video camera, document your story. I bought little $30 Cube video cameras and started giving them out to homeless so they could document some of their police abuses and have a voice of their own, and say that I'm happy to receive any video you want to upload, and I'll get it out there, etc. It doesn't cost more than $30, a piece. Well, here's a camera. Do you need that? Do you know how to use it? This is how you can help this community be visible in this culture. So contributing value. The more value you contribute, I would say, is part of a metric to your growth and healing and integration. Because if all you do is survive and just hate yourself and everyone else for the rest of this lifetime, but survive, that's great. You've survived. You've gotten to your first level of need. But you're not going to have self-esteem unless you can find a way to become closer to the person that you want to be when you're healthy. And we all want to matter. We all want to be valued when we are sane and when we are healthy. So it is a metric of integration, health, and sanity, that you are doing anything at all to contribute something to someone else. And as I said, the easiest thing for me was to contribute to other trauma survivors, because it's a little bit of a stretch to want to help your abuser, when they're doing so little to help you. Now, education is another metric. So much of empathy comes from understanding. And so much of understanding leads to empathy, acceptance, and love. If you understand how your biology has been fucked up, you will have a lot more empathy for the pain going on in your body. If you understand the statistics, like 2.5 million American children run away from abusive families in this culture, because they'd rather risk death and sexual abuse out in the wild than face the humiliation and the trauma at home. Millions of American children are doing this. That's a lot of abuse. And one can, in this way, somewhat shift from the unhealthy ruminating into learning that this is not about you. This is about us as a culture and a nation. And if the way you're being treated by the culture in this state is helping you get worse, not better, that's not about you either. Because sure, you could take your own life and, Many do. But this culture will just produce another wave of abuse. The area that you can possibly contribute is by telling the story, one, affirming not only your own story, but telling the story for others, so that this culture can mature, can grow, can be an adult for once. Abusive parents who are immature, narcissistic, regressed children abuse other children with their giant bodies. We fail to remember how big grown-ups are when we're 5 years old, and this isn't going to stop until we as a culture face our pathological treatment of one another, particularly our children, and to a lesser extent our grown females. Because first we shame and attack the feminine in men until they feel ashamed of everything feminine inside them, and they attack and suppress, and men hate their own femininity because they get attacked and shamed for it. And then they're asked to love women who are the very expression of their own femininity. And you cannot love in another what you hate and loathe in yourself. If we continue to treat men and teach men to hate and feel ashamed of their feminine side, we are training and teaching men to hate and feel rage at women who express the feminine side that they've been taught is taboo and unacceptable. And so this process of education is partly, it's not about you in this stage of education, but also empathizing and learning. This is a system that creates abuse and then punishes abuse survivors and punishes abusers, but it doesn't heal the pattern. It creates scapegoats. First, it scapegoats the victim, and if the victim gets enough evidence, then it transfers the scapegoat on the abuser. The abuser has generally been at least as abused as the abuse they're dishing out. It may be psychological abuse that the abuser is expressing physically. Particularly men tend to be abused more psychologically, and then they express their abuse more physically. In part because to express emotional abuse would take them too close to their feelings, and men are shamed for having feelings. Education, the more you learn. Now, I couldn't read a book in all of this because it was too hard to concentrate. It was just too much pain. So I listened to YouTube videos and Audible books. I listened to all the Audible books on trauma. And Bessel van der Kolk, I would start with that. One of the best in terms of getting a landscape. Learn about the terrain. Learn that it's not particularly personal, that, nature produces very few suicidal creatures. But human beings have created a microclimate of cruelty and sociopathic behavior and shame that creates much more suicide in the human species than in, say, the apes. Apes don't generally commit suicide. Birds don't generally commit suicide. And so it suggests that there's something about our culture, not about nature itself, that leads to this kind of torture chamber. And how do we get out of it? What can we learn from nature? What does what does my dog do when I abuse the dog? The dog runs away, shakes himself to diffuse all the energy, and he's back to square one and re-engages with life. He doesn't go and commit suicide. And so, but we don't. We ruminate, and it gets worse, and this and that, and then we feel terrible, and then we shame ourselves for feeling terrible and all that. And so we create these pressure cookers. How do we get out? So education. The more you are learning. In the last week, have you learned anything? Have you bought an Audible book? Have you gone to the library and thumbed through a trauma book? Have you can go sit in a library if you're homeless or something and keep warm and read a book and learn things. And this puts you in a role of being a teacher. Because I can tell you that I did $150,000 of therapy before my sexual abuse by a therapist, and not one of them knew about trauma enough to educate me. None of them recommended a trauma book. None of them recommended, saw the symptoms of trauma. They were waiting for me, as a psychologically illiterate American male, to come to them and say, I think I have trauma, I need to do some trauma therapy. But that's backwards. In a psychologically illiterate culture, you're not going to go to a therapist and say, I already know what's wrong with me, here's how you can help me. That's the therapist's job, to help people who are psychologically illiterate learn about this terrain. And they don't do their job very well in my personal experience. So you can actually teach therapists. I've taught a number of therapists about what they didn't know, so that they can be a little bit nicer to their next client. And so if you learn a lot about trauma through this, you will be part of a 5% minority, or less, could be as low as 1%, that really understands the terrain and the impact of trauma. We spend trillions of dollars over time coping with psychological disease that we create and don't know how to diagnose and don't know how to repair. If you can become a wizard in that terrain, because you're living it and you're reading and saying, yeah, that bit fits, and you can present that to other people who are often too dumb to know that they don't know it and too illiterate to know that they're illiterate in that domain, so they're not necessarily going to thank you. But if anyone does learn that from you, you've done a tremendous service, because that meme ripples out. And our culture needs trauma literacy, needs to recognize what a big deal it is, how expensive it is to pretend it's not being dealt, to pretend it's not an issue. It is an enormous tax on the well-being, on the economy, on the ecology, and on the sanity of this culture. And you can become an expert. So everything that you learn that's useful in any way, that gives you empathy, that gives you understanding, that gives you technical knowledge, is going to help you. But it is exactly what this culture needs desperately, but is too ignorant to know that it needs desperately. I had my abusive therapist say, oh, trauma isn't our thing. And it's like, well, that's interesting, because you know how to create PTSD in your clients, but you don't know how to heal it. It should be your thing. You just haven't grasped how much you don't know. So read this book, and a few of them did. And they're like, oh my goodness, we're not fundamentally evil people. Highly abusive people, as I say, have generally been highly abused and are too ignorant to know it. And if their parents called all that abuse love, they think they're being loving. That's just cross-wiring and language. So if you are learning at all, you are growing, and that's something to appreciate. That's something this culture needs. You're in the right direction. Next is integrity and sanity. And this comes in part through reading. It comes in part through support group. It comes in part from watching YouTube videos about sexual abuse and this and that and the other, and whatever, beatings, the physiology. You need to know that this is not ultimately about you being a good or a bad person. And in order to do that, you have to make the connections. When my mother shrieked at me and hit me and threw me on the floor and I'm 2 years old, I learned I couldn't get close to someone and had to shut my feelings down. As someone who shuts my feelings down, I'm not as empathic, which means I can hurt other people. And there's a connection. What happened here led to this, We have to understand that connection, to integrate, to understand how we got here. We didn't get here because we're going to hell or something like that. We got here through a sustained pattern of ignorance, of fear, of shame, etc. And if we can voice that, And again, I turn to videos because they're the easiest. At 4 in the morning, if I wake up with an insight, I can press record, share the insight. I now know what's going on. And dreams can help with that. So dreams, paying attention to your dreams, paying attention to your feelings, paying attention to how, what's going on in your body and stuff. These are all parts of the process of gaining integrity with yourself. These are the systems running in this body. These are the thoughts running in this mind. These are the beliefs that this person and this person shoved down my throat, and they are creating this pressure cooker. And that wasn't love, that was love. And it wasn't for my own good that went on here. And that wasn't okay that went on here. And that was perfectly obvious that I was in crisis, but the so-and-so was too scared to respond. That's sociopathic behavior. Doesn't mean they're any more evil than you. It just means they're in an emotionally illiterate culture. Integrity and sanity is piecing that puzzle together. And we can look at that in statistics. 87% of people who are sexually abused by a priest end up feeling this, doing this, and this, and this. Okay, that's sanity. When you confuse and say this is God's will, and then you do the most horrible things imaginable, you've fucked that person up. That's not God's will. That's a fucked up person. You got to untangle it. And so you got to read those books to say, wow, gosh, I made that mistake as well. I thought that I was a this or whatever. And, I thought the Catholic Church was more important than me. And so I was doing God a favor by not saying anything. That's why the abuse continues. I see. So this is the process. The more sane you become, the more integrated you become. What this is giving you is an effective map. So that the next time someone abuses you, and says, oh, I love you so much, that's why I need you to ruin your career and ruin this and do this, and because I love you, meaning I'm in lust and attachment and I'm going to use you and I don't care about what's important to you in your life because I was raised by narcissists. See, that's a much more sane understanding. Now you've got a map. You think you love me, but you're abusing me. I see. Well, let me educate you. Oh, no, I just need you. Well, okay, well, no more of that. No more of that. Go and abuse someone else. And if you want to learn what love is, let's talk. You can move towards sanity, something our culture desperately needs. The other is goals. And what I found worked for me, I used to achieve, I've achieved thousands of goals. I had quarterly, monthly, yearly, daily goals. I had action plans. And as I say, I've achieved thousands of goals in my lifetime with a goal system. And goals in general escalate constructive behavior by about 400%. If you have clearly written goals for your life, your week, your day, your month, and you respond to them, you will get about 400% more of your goals done than if you just kind of think, oh, I'd like to do this sometime, and maybe do, maybe don't get around to it. So, goals. But I was exhausted. I had chronic fatigue from, the adrenal collapse, from the hurt, from the pain. It was hard to focus, And so what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to let myself addict and do whatever I want for 21 hours of the day. I will manage and cope for 21 hours a day. But 3 hours a day, I'm going to do stuff on this list here. I'm going to take steps. I'm going to spend at least an hour working on my goals. I'm going to get some physical exercise. I'm going to eat well. I'm going to do something romantic with my partner. I'm going to do this 3 hours a day. And so I had my little list. Have I exercised for at least 10 minutes? That's it, 10 minutes. I did a little song. Let's dance to one pop song a day, just to get, the chemicals moving. If I haven't done it, okay, just dance, move the body. I'm going to spend an hour doing something. I'm going to, do something on, that's taking me in this direction. I'm going to listen to an Audible book or whatever. 3 hours a day. You set your limit that you can win at in your current state. 10 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day. Most of you can manage 30 minutes a day, but if not, 10 minutes a day. For 10 minutes a day, and you build up. Well, the nice thing is after spending months doing 3 hours a day something constructive, it created a positive momentum. My life got a little better. Well, then I can tolerate my life, so I'm not in so much pain. Now I can be present for 4 hours a day, 5 hours a day, and I'm going to get through that. And you're just making a set block of time in which you're going to do something good for your life, for your healing, for your survival needs, etc. And stick to that, a manageable block of time. And it doesn't have to be at a set time, because you may be feeling terrible that before you go to bed, that amount of time. So you have a set time, you have a strategy. As I said, that was my strategy. You focus first on survival, if survival is an issue. Then you focus on a fun future and on healing. If you're in survival, you've got to take care of the survival first. Otherwise, there is no fun future. And then appreciate what you did. And that's another thing. You can write emails. I like this little ritual. Dear Dane, I appreciate you for getting out of bed this morning. I appreciate you for brushing your teeth. I appreciate you for moving my body. I appreciate you for telling the truth. I appreciate you for making a video that might help another trauma survivor. You've done that, and I appreciate it. Celebrate that block of time that you did something good, and use that to build self-esteem. So this is, if you are moving in that direction, and don't push it so much into pain that you have to addict, or it's like I have to be perfect. No. That's completely, absurd to expect you to be your best self in the middle of trauma and PTSD. That's, but what can you do? And design that little block that it's packed full of good things, that it's not miserable, it's good things. So that's on the goal. If you are making progress on your goals, you are making progress. You're in the right direction. And cut down on unnecessary obligations and things, that are taking you in the wrong direction. The mostly, after experiences with my chiropractor and with clients and stuff, I found that social interactions in America weren't making me feel better. They were making me feel worse. So I didn't put those in my goals. But meditation, connecting with the sense of who I am, connecting with all the spirit help that is out there. And again, you don't have to believe it or whatever, but just have a little humility. Reality is really, really, really big. We are very, very, very tiny. We like to think that the only thing that exists is what we can see out of these observing and measuring devices. That's a little bit narcissistic. Who knows what's out there? Well, my bet is that somewhere in all the possibility of what's out there, there are intelligent, conscious beings who hate to see other beings in pain and may not be bound by time and space. And if you call them angels, great. If you call them spirit helpers, great. If you call them God, Goddess, all that is, wonderful. Connect, open up, feel the love that can come in perfectly because it's coming through your imagination. My bet is that if you can imagine it, it's there. That reality is so big that it's much bigger than the human imagination. And if it's much bigger than the human imagination, it includes everything that I can imagine, which means that everything I can imagine is real. So I need to just imagine and connect through imagination to some of the profound, loving, healing consciousness that would gladly, it's not in scarcity, it's not ignorant, it's not sociopathic, it's not in blame, it's not busy, that wants to love me and support me. And I can receive that. And as I say, I connect a lot with that, with the meditations with the channel Lazarus. you can find it anywhere you want. Jesus, Buddha, other, I mean, not everyone on the planet has been sociopathic since the dawn of time. You can imagine being loved by Mother Teresa. I mean, someone who's got the smarts and got it together to be a good mentor and healer for you. If you imagine that, it changes your chemistry. It's that simple. And the more you imagine it, the more that becomes part of the reality. And that may be the sanest and healthiest part of your reality, because it's not limited by the default, ignorance and blockages of your culture. That's, in the goals. And finally, trauma, disrespect, dishonor, hopelessness, depression leads to violence and leads to addiction. Many people cut themselves. Some people do things they know will hurt them, and they feel they deserve to be punished, whatever. If your depression, violence, and addiction and shame is going down as a result of things that you are doing in that window of time, keep doing them. Do more of that. If they are not, look at another approach. Throw everything that I've set out. Look for an approach that reduces your depression, your violence, your addiction, your shame. By violence, it can be, for me, it came out with explosive criticism. I just couldn't not criticize my wife or criticize myself or criticize other people or whatever. It just, bursts out because there's so much criticism going inward. Why aren't I doing better? Why was I such a dope to hire that therapist? And so, it builds up and it's got to explode somewhere. Well, I knew I was in the right direction when I could praise and be grateful to my wife much more than I criticized her. No, she's not perfect. Nobody is. But she's absolutely, I don't know anyone more amazing, on the planet who is able and willing to spend time with me and caring, etc. And so the things that I do that reduce that's progress, something to be appreciated for, something to note down. I wasn't as critical today. I wasn't as depressed today. I wasn't as ashamed. Now, depression, just so you know, is a phenomena of folded in energy that can't move. It's kind of like taking a garden hose, which is flowing and alive, jetting water everywhere, and then you crimp it, and then you crimp it again, and you crimp it again. And so finally, just this tiny drop of energy comes out the other side. And the solution is technical. You've got to open it up and let energy flow through. Let the hate through. Let the anger through. Let the rage through. Let the fear through. Let the grief through. Let the pain through. You've got to let the jet return. When it is flowing, you are not depressed. So depression is a symptom of crimped up energy. So the answer to depression, the antidote to depression, is to break the rules that are crimping that energy. Oh my gosh, spiritual people aren't angry. Okay, you're blocking it that way. Nice people don't do this and I want to do this. Okay, you're blocking it that way. What would people think of me? I can't do. You're blocking it that way. We have thousands of judgmental blocks to our, jet of energy that can flow through us that sap vitality. And we have to spend energy to hold that crimp in place, because if we let go of all that fear, etc., and just be ourselves, that energy will flow. It wants to flow. The water builds up pressure and wants to come out of that hose. We're blocking it in some way, with fear, with shame, with panic, with uncertainty, with just holding on for dear life and not wanting anything to change because we're so overwhelmed. We're slowing it all down. That is what depression is telling us. To heal depression, you open it up. And so, for example, I found that because Thailand is a far less judgmental culture, I could let myself go in Thailand in ways that I couldn't in the United States. because I know how Americans judge themselves and are therefore judging me. And it felt crappy and painful. But I did all kinds of things to deliberately break the rules. I would sing. I would stay up and, all night and sleep all day. I would have a midnight feast. I would have a 5-hour massage session. You're not supposed to have a 5-hour. Why not? Let's do that. I did a whole series on YouTube on emotional taboos, where basically everything I felt I'd be judged for, I just put it out there. Every taboo I could think of, I put it out there. Well, of course, there's this panic. Oh my gosh, my life is going to end. I'm going to be ostracized for all time. And then nothing happens. And it's like, I can let more energy flow. And so breaking all of the rules that are creating that crimp is part of it. Now, once you've uncrimped the hose and it's jetting water all over the place, yes, it can cause erosion. It can spray people who don't want to be wet. Deal with it. This cult is taking abuse survivors and shaming them into depressed states and then getting on with their life and letting people just collapse in these depressed states. Fuck you, culture. Deal with my jet of water falling around. No, I haven't learned how to spray this carefully because this cult doesn't want to teach people how to do this in an intelligent way and not be depressed. But part of the release is to say, it's not a good idea if I end up dying and this cult remains ignorant of its many flaws because everyone is politely dying rather than communicate the need for change. That's not a good outcome. Far better to have people who have been abused, etc., shouting in the streets and people saying, wow, I guess there are a lot of abused people. What should we do about it? See, that's intelligent. What should we do about it? But this cult doesn't ask that question until there's some visibility, some discomfort. And too many depressed people don't want to offend anyone. So this is what I want to do. I want to shout and jump up and down, but everyone would be upset in my office, so I can't do that. Well, maybe go to the parking lot and shout up and down. And if people say, why are you shouting up and down? You say, I'm feeling depressed and miserable, and I'm tired of holding it in. Well, me too. I'm feeling depressed and miserable too. It never occurred to me to jump up and down and shout. Well, why not? Who's it hurting? Do we need more blindness in this cult? Do we need more stupidity? Or do we need people to say, I don't know what to do, but something has to be done? And this here is part of that. You see, I'm energized because I'm saying all the wrong things. I know I shouldn't be saying these things. There'd be anarchy and outrage. It's making the audience uncomfortable. Oh my goodness. They think I'm crazy. Fuck them. Let it happen. Let it flow. It's not all about what every other judgmental, critical, paranoid, person has twiddled into their brain and blocked themselves up through the fucked up nature of this cult. It's not it. And you will not be depressed. So if you're doing things that don't be depressed, so, for example, I was often confused and I felt like I've got to make up my mind. Should I go this way or this way? And I didn't know. So I would drive this way. And I was like, no. And I'd turn the motorbike around and I'd drive the other way. And I was like, no. I would just let myself change my mind for an hour. And suddenly something would happen. Oh, that's it. It wasn't that. It wasn't that. It wasn't that. And then I'd go off in a new direction. If you drive a different way to work, if you ride in a motorbike rather than a car, if you ride in a car rather than a motorbike, if you get on public transportation, if you do stuff you're not supposed to do because it's not efficient, or I don't ride public transportation, or I don't talk to strangers. Talk to strangers. Break the fucking rules. And the water will come out. It'll flow out muddy and cruddy at first because that's what, if you block water in a hose for years and it's muddy water to begin with, you're going to all kind of crud in there. Blow it all out. This is one benefit to kind of binge type stuff. Watch Netflix for 24 hours. eat sugar, shout, do stuff that flows things. If you're moving in that direction, where your depression is down, if your violence is down, if your addiction is down, if your shame is down, and your vitality is up, once you've released that energy is then available for your goals, for your education, for your healing and past future, to meet your human needs. And maybe you can expand from 30 minutes a day of sanity and doing constructive things to an hour, to 2 hours. Let some more energy out. It's all in there. And this is a very fundamental paradigm, by the way. People who are stuck in depression, who are stuck in terror, who feel exhausted, of course, they have a boundless amount of energy. It's just all bound up. The boundless energy is bound up because they're spending half of their energy to suppress the other half of it. And you can't learn to direct it until you're spewing it out there. So I would tell clients, a very unprofessional thing to do. They'd say, "Hey, Dane, how you doing?" I'm a landscape contractor. That's how I make money. I would say, "I'm miserable, I'm depressed, barely get out of bed today." And most of them would just say, "Oh, good, keep it up." In other words, they weren't really asking how I was doing. They were, just making small talk and being invisible in a shame-based cult that doesn't see one another. But it's like, the end of the world didn't happen there. I'm obviously in a crazy cult that, one client just said, "Keep it up," and as if this was wonderful news, clearly saying they didn't want to talk about it. I thought, well, this is just how we get into this mess in this culture. Nobody wants to hear what's actually going on, and so they don't know what's actually going on, so they can't respond to it. So we do stupid things as a cult. If we would all talk about all that's going on, maybe we'd have an intelligent education that addressed what's going on, rather than pretending that we need to know algebra for our future careers. When's the last time you learned algebra and needed it? It's ridiculous. So this is the movement. And if you're making progress on any of these metrics at all, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, that's success. That's miraculous in this culture because so many people, go down and go down. If you make progress in this domain, you will become more and more self-reliant. If you ask for help and receive constructive help, that's another metric. That breaks the shame cycle. It breaks the ridiculous idea that people who ask for help are weak. People who ask for help and receive help and integrate it become stronger and stronger. In other words, the strongest people have the courage to ask for help, and then they become even stronger when they utilize that help to grow stronger. And eventually you'll be able to help someone else because you've been helped, you've lifted up. When you're drowning, you can't help anyone else not drown. If you receive help out of the water and get the water out of your system, you can now help someone else who's stuck in the water. And there's no shame for them being stuck in the water, and there's no shame for you. And so moving towards asking and receiving help. Now this, again, thankfully, can be from non-human beings. Again, that belief in the larger framework of reality, that there are beings out there that would love to help you, that would say, "Yes, I've been watching you suffer in there. We respect you. We're not going to interfere, but we'll help you. We'll send love into you. We'll let you know that we totally get it. You're in that crazy human world there where they're doing all this weird stuff, and, who knows why they're doing that, but, you don't deserve to suffer." That's all progress. And so, I have the board here with this. One thing you might do is make a little sketch. Make your own metrics, make a little sketch, and just see how you're doing. And I have helped one other traumatized person go from desperate trauma to way out of trauma, etc., because she was willing to receive help, and so I helped her. And she, of course, grew dramatically to a point where she was able to help me. and that's beautiful. That's human. That's love. That's normal. We just fuck that up with culture. So good luck on this. And I'm absolutely convinced, because I've seen it in the nature of who we are, that there's a part in each one of us that wants to grow in these ways. It's just a matter of getting the blocks out of the way and getting our culturated mind, the mind that's been trained to focus on so many other bizarre things like what's the name brand of your clothing, or how does my lipstick work or look, or whatever. That's not progress, unless you're in an image-based, corporate environment, etc., and that's part of your survival and security, is you've got to look good. Well, then do it. But these things really make a difference and lead to this phenomena of becoming part of the minority in our culture that participate meaningfully in post-traumatic growth, where you can become more on the other side of a severe trauma than you were going in. And in doing so, be a resource to others in the community.